extrajudicial killing, enforced disappearances in Pakistan, and arbitrary detention. And for this very important conversation, we're very lucky to have an eminent panel with a wide range and diverse range of expertise. The first panelist that we have is Senator Faratullah Babar, who needs no introduction for anyone acquainted with the struggle for human rights, for democratic freedoms in Pakistan, and we're very grateful to have Babar Saab with us today. We have Mr. Rory McGovern, who works for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. He's the chief of the Asia Pacific section, and his presence I think will be deeply enriching in terms of not only a conversation and insight about the situation in Pakistan, but perhaps a comparative perspective, both regionally and internationally. We have Mr. Shabir Hussain Gagyani, again a senior lawyer. He's joined us from Peshawar, has worked on these issues for a long time, and we're very grateful to have him. We have Mrs. Amna Janjua, again, very well known in many ways. She has symbolized over the past decade or more the struggle that the families and the loved ones of those who are victims of enforced disappearances have to go through, and has been steadfast and frankly sort of displayed very inspiring courage. So we're very lucky to have. We have Mr. Michael P. Jett, who is the legal advisor from for the United States Embassy, and we hope that he will also will benefit from his contributions on the international perspective, perhaps, and we're very grateful to have him. The session would be bilingual at times because of international speakers. Perhaps I'll try as far as possible to do it in English, but just a housekeeping note. So, and I think I'll begin this conversation by Senator Faratullah Babar. And Babar Saab, हमने जबरी गुमशुदगी, मावराए अदालत कत्ल, arbitrary detention, ये मसाइल तो पाकिस्तान में कई दिहाइयों से हैं, और पाकिस्तान जो है, पाकिस्तान को सिक्योरिटी चैलेंजेस का सामना है. हम सुनते आ रहे हैं कि हालात जो हैं वो हम हालत जंग में हैं, exceptional times call for exceptional measures, and this idea of sort of creating an island of exceptionalism on something as important as fundamental liberty or right to life is something that we've now seen for decades. I mean, you would know more. And what you have struggled for this for decades as well, including attempts at legislative change. Because I think we sort of, to have the benefit of you as somebody who's been a member of parliament for as long as you have been. Why have we failed? Why have we failed both at the legislative level on both enforced disappearances and arbitrary detention, but also at the implementation level?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is that okay? Thank you very much. Honorable members of Presidium, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, आपने दुरुस्त कहा कि enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings has been with us for the last several decades. It has been with us for the last several decades, but it was institutionalized during the days of Musharraf. And General Musharraf has himself acknowledged in his book, In the Line of Fire, और वो कहते हैं on page 237, he is on record to have said that those who say that we have not done enough in the war on terror, they should ask the CIA how many millions of dollars they have given to us for handing them over the people of Pakistan. since no action was taken against Musharraf for this confession of extrajudicial transfer of people to the CIA, including extrajudicial killings, that is why since then it has been institutionalized, unfortunately, for the last now 20 years. And when I say it is institutionalized, I also say that the state agencies are involved. Let us not mince words. रियासत के इदारे मुलव्वस हैं. How? On the 28th of July 2018, we called the chairman of the Enforced Disappearances Commission to the Senate. And he was asked many questions, and we asked him, sir, your law under which the commission has been set up, it also requires you to prosecute and investigate those who are involved in this. And now you have been the chairman for the last several years. Have you been able to find as to who were the abductors? He said that whenever we ask the people who abducted you, they say कि जी बस छोड़ दें, बस हम रिहा होकर आ गए हैं. We said, Mr. Chairman, but did it not occur to you that isn't that a very surprising statement by every person who has been abducted कि जी बस छोड़ दें? You should have come to the parliament and said this is a serious problem. And then he conceded. And it is recorded in the minutes of the meeting of that day, and that is why I'm talking about this. It is not a state secret. Any one of you can go and ask for a copy of the minutes. And that was a meeting not in camera. It was open to the media. It is a different matter that the media did not carry the proceedings the next day. But the media was present. लेकिन किसी ने report नहीं किया. And he stated, when he was pressed hard and harder, उसने कहा कि 153 army personnel have been identified and action is being taken against them. That was 28th July 2018. 28th July 2021 has come and passed. No action has been taken. Therefore, I say that the state agencies are involved. And do you recall that the ISPR also made a statement in July 2019? Now, this is a statement of the ISPR, no secret. And they say, not all missing persons are in the custody of the army. Therefore, meaning thereby कि हाँ, कुछ हमारे पास हैं, कम हैं या ज़्यादा हैं. They are in their custody, it's admitted by the ISPR. And it is also a fact that when Akhtar Mangal threatened to quit the alliance unless the missing persons were released from Balochistan, of which he had given a list, and he threatened that he will not vote for the budget, his demand was accepted. 48 people were released, and then he voted for the government in the budget. Who released them? Who accepted his demand? So my second point was that the state agencies are involved. The third point I want to make is that the Commission on Enforced Disappearances has failed. It has failed because it was required to investigate and prosecute those involved in it. It has not been able to investigate even one person, let alone prosecute them. It claims to have secured the release of 3,800 people. Not in one case has it been able to investigate and prosecute. The complete impunity of the crime. And you also said, why have we failed? And this is my last point. But look at the way how serious the matter is. The Senate Human Rights Committee asked the government of Balochistan कि हमें list दे दो. The mutilated bodies are found on the roadside. How many of them in the last 2 years? Pat came the reply, 53. He said, all right. Has any FIR been registered? No. Why no FIR? Because the relatives did not want. Imagine the disconnect between the citizen and the state is so serious कि अपने म्यूचुलेटेड बॉडीज़ का जो है वो FIR दर्ज नहीं करते, कहते हैं कि इन पर एतबार नहीं है. So this is the seriousness of the problem. Now, why it is happening? No matter आप कोई भी कानून बना दो, already in the PPC, enforced kidnapping is a crime, but it is not being implemented. More than 7,000 cases of enforced disappearances have been registered, but it is not being investigated, not in one case. Why? Because there is elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room does not permit, because they are the agencies, the official agencies are involved, and they do not permit. And the solution of the enforced disappearances, in my view, is we must have a law to bring the ISI and other intelligence agencies under some legislation. And I'm happy to inform you that in 2015, the Senate of Pakistan unanimously made recommendations, including a bill to bring ISI under the law. 6 साल हो गए, दिसंबर 2015, दिसंबर 2021, 6 साल हो गए. Under the rules of business, the government had to come back to the parliament to accept that or to say, हम नहीं कर सकते, and these are the reasons. Neither the government has come back accepting that legislation, nor the government has come back to the parliament to say कि हम इन वजूहात की बिना पे नहीं कर सके, because the elephant in the room does not permit. So मैं आपसे कहूँगा कि the reason is the elephant in the room that must pushed out, and that can be pushed out when people like you may cross the political divide, the civil society, when people like you raise voice as you are doing it today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Baba Saab, for this very succinct, but yes, very bleak landscape that we face. And you've talked about the failures both at the executive level, at the political level, to not address and indeed push out the elephant in the room. But you also talked about the law and attempts at making new laws, but also, as you mentioned, with the PPC, where there are many offenses which already exist. And I think that we have Shabir Gagyani Saab, and then the role of courts. Gagyani Saab, जो बाबर साहब ने बात की, जो मसाइल हैं, जो कि मसाइल सियासी भी हैं, जो मसाइल इम्प्यूनिटी के भी हैं, मगर हमने देखा कि खित्ते में या बाकी दुनिया में भी कि जब मावराए अदालत कत्ल होते हैं, जब तशद्दुद के मामलात होते हैं, जब जबरी गुमशुदगी के मामलात होते हैं, तो शायद अदालतों का जो रोल होता है, खा वो आइनी जो उनके पास जुरिस्डिक्शन है हेबियस की, या फिर उनके पास जो जुरिस्डिक्शन है क्रिमिनल प्रोसिक्यूशन की, वो एक फाइनल सेफ गार्ड होता है. जब आप कहते हो कि पार्लियामान ने अपना काम नहीं किया, जब आप कहते हो कि एग्जीक्यूटिव या मुकन्ना ने अपना काम नहीं किया, और क्योंकि आप एक प्रैक्टिसिंग वकील हैं, आप इन मामलात से डील कर रहे हैं, बहुत अरसे से कर रहे हैं, तो पाकिस्तान की अदालतों का जो रवैया रहा है, या जो उनका इस तरह के मामलात से डील करने का जो तरीक़ाकार रहा है, वो पहला तो सवाल ये होगा कि पहला सवाल तो मैं ये पूछने लगा था कि आप उससे मुतमईन हैं, वो तो उसका तो जवाब होगा कि नहीं, वो तो हमें लगता है कि, लेकिन क्या वजूहात हैं जो मैंने बाबर साहब से पूछा था कि एज अ पार्लियामेंटेरियन वो समझते हैं कि कहाँ पर सुकम है, इस फेलियर की वजह क्या है. तो हमारे अदालती निज़ाम का एक मौसर तरीके से इंसाफ की फरहमी जो है विक्टिम्स को, उसकी क्या वजूहात हैं आपकी नज़र में, आपके तजर्बे में, आपके मुशाहिदे में?
Your good self regarding the extrajudicial killing, first I will take this point.
Sure.
That in our country, the extrajudicial killing always used as a political tools for obtaining the political goals or for suppressing the speaking power of the public, always. In 2006, after the Talibanization, the people, especially the people of the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Balochistan, and especially the citizen of FATA, federally administered tribal area, and provincially administered tribal area, they were already deprived of the constitutional rights. And then in Talibanization, first they were deprived in the hands of Taliban by taking their property in the name of Chanda and the name of jihad. And thereafter, they were insulted, their dignity, they were deprived from their dignity in the name of Haya and Farda. Even the women folk were given severe punishment, that these are the punishment under the law for central offenses according to their own version. Then in 2008, the army operation were started by the security forces. And there was, in 2008, there was no legislation from the parliament in this respect to give a legal protection to the armed forces activities. So the extrajudicial killing and enforced disappearance started mostly during the military operation. In the military operation, thousands of people were extrajudicial murdered without any allegation, and even their dead bodies were not given to their LRs. And also in 2010 and 2009, thousands of people were disappeared. And in 2011, our parliament gave a legal protection, might be at the direction of security forces, at the direction of the army personnel, at the direction of the GHQ. LA was launched with the name of Action in Aid Civil Power Regulation 2012. That was launched in the FATA administered tribal area and also the provincial administered tribal area. Thousands of people were killed by the army personnel without any jurisdiction, without any legal justification, without any allegation. They were not produced before the court. No statement of allegation were provided to them. Neither any grounds were given to the LR that for what reason, under what law, and for what crime they were killed extrajudicially. Second, the enforced disappearance was started in 2008. And our legislation, which is not seeing the job of a democratic government, but at the behest and command of others, of our agencies, this law in 2011 was enforced. And unconstitutionally, against the Constitution, Article 2013, the effect was given from 2008. And all the illegal action of the army personnel of the secret agency, a legal protection was given under this law by giving retrospective effect to this unconstitutional and black law. Then date-free law was challenged before the Peshawar High Court, and the Peshawar High Court declared date-free law as black law, unconstitutional, against the humanity. And date-free judgment was then challenged by the state before the Honorable Supreme Court in 2009. Date-free judgment was suspended by the Honorable Supreme Court, and sorry to say, regret to say, that till date, after suspending, no hearing, the case has not been fixed by no hearing. Farhatullah Babar Sahib bhi usme ek petitioner hai, along with others, Bushra Gawar Sahiba. तो जो मैं अदालती निज़ाम की तरफ आता हूँ, I know that the people say that जो crime की शरह जो रोज़ बरोज़ बढ़ रही है, it is due to the non-punishment verdicts of the court. It is not, I'm not agree with this proposition, because the courts always run and shall runs on the law, on the procedure, on the constitution. आज तक कोई बिला जो कि फरहतुल्लाह बाबर साहब ने जिस तरह फरमाया कि अभी एक बिल जो कौमी असम्बली में पास हुए, सेनेट को पेश हुए, चूँकि आई एम डीलिंग द enforced disappearance cases and thousands of cases I am handling, And in more than 1,000 cases, the Missing Person Commission, जो इस्लामाबाद में है, उनकी डायरेक्शन पर 1,000 top FIRs have been registered against the security forces. But till date, no investigation has yet been conducted against any security forces. What to say about their prosecution, what to say about their trial or punishment. तो लॉ की गैर मौजूदगी में हमारे मुल्क का अलमिया ये है कि यहाँ जो भी इशू खड़ा हो जाते हैं, जस्ट सपोज आज इस कॉन्फ्रेंस में एक बात आ गई तो हमारे लेजिस्लेटर क्या करते हैं कि लॉ बनाते हैं. मेकिंग ऑफ लॉ इज़ नॉट ए बिग डील, इज नॉट ए बिग इशू, बट इन्फोर्समेंट ऑफ लॉ इट इज़ ए बिग इशू, इट इज़ ए बिग डील इन पाकिस्तान. हमारे मुल्क में रोज़ाना पिछले हफ्ते जो हम न्यूज़पेपर देख रहे थे तो तकरीबन 14 की 24 लॉ एक ही दिन में एक ही आवाज़ से पास हो गई. तो कवानीन पास करना ये कोई इतना बड़ा काम नहीं है एक असम्बली के लिए, कानून साज असम्बली के लिए. उसको इन्फोर्स करना, उसकी इम्प्लीमेंट करना ये अहम बात है. तो एक्स्ट्रा जुडिशल किलिंग एंड आल्सो द इन्फोर्स डिसअपीयरेंस, इट इज़ द ओनली जॉब of the state agency, of those agency who are an oath under the constitution कि हम constitution right को protect करेंगे आप each and every citizen. And they day by day this aspect is increasing in our country कि वो कवानीन को, law को वो violate कर रही है. जो मैंने एक्शन इन एड सिविल पावर रेगुलेशन 2011 की जिक्र की, the same is completely unconstitutional law. In our constitution, in our criminal procedure, it is mandatory that if a person is arrested by any security agency, by police, then he should be presented before the competent court within 24 hours. In Detention Black law, the security forces can detain a person without any allegation, without any report, without any complaint for indefinite period. And there are cases which are still pending before the Peshawar High Court in which the many persons were kept in detention, illegal detention for more than 8 years, for more than 9 years. And thereafter, when we filed constitution petition before the Peshawar High Court, their cases were proceeded. Then after keeping such like person in illegal detention, then in 2015, military courts were announced for 2 years, and in 2007 further 2-year extension were given. In Detention cases, they were challenged, the conviction were challenged before the Peshawar High Court. All the judgment were set aside by the Peshawar High Court, and the state agencies, the jail authorities were directed that there are no allegations, there are no proof against this person, and they should be released. The release orders were issued by the High Court. But sorry to say, again sorry should say, with great respect to the courts, the Honorable Supreme Court again suspended the Ratify order. In our judicial history, it is the first time that acquitted person have been detained in the jail, although their acquittal order have been issued, their release order have been issued by the Peshawar High Court. So there is no failure on the part of the court, in my humble opinion, but there is no specific law to enable the courts to deal such like cases, to deal such like delinquent officials of the security agencies. तो मेरी राय में जो ये enforced disappearance है, extrajudicial killing है, even illegal detention है, the internment center, you know better, that in under Detention unconstitutional law internment center was established. एक बात मैं ऐड करता जाऊं कि हम मुकाबला करते हैं कि हम मुहज़्ज़ब मुल्क है. जब अमेरिका ग्वांतानामा बे की जेल बना रही थी तो उनके सिटीज़न दे प्रोटेस्टेड कि इस तरह की इनह्यूमन अनकॉन्स्टिट्यूशन जेल हमारी ज़मीन पर नहीं बनेगी, अगरचे वो एलियन एनिमी की नहीं बनी थी. हमारे मुल्क का अलमिया ये है कि हमारे अपने सिटीज़न के लिए ग्वांतानामा बे से सख्त डिटेंशन सेंटर हमारे खैबर पख्तूनख्वा के डिस्ट्रिक्ट लकी मरवत एंड डिस्ट्रिक्ट कोहाट, even one internment center is adjacent to the constitution court of circuit bench Swat of our Peshawar High Court at Fizagat Swat, at Khyber district, And in our settled area, internment centers have been established, and 8,000 people. In Guantanamo Bay, as per their calculation, only 780 person, alien enemy, were detained. But in our internment center, as per report of the state submitted before the Honorable Supreme Court while hearing the cases of internment center, as per their report, more than 8,000 persons are detained there since 7 years and since 8 years. So in my humble opinion, it is not the failure of the courts, it is the failure of democratic government, it is the failure of our legislators.
Thank you, Gagyani Saab. Indeed, the failure is of the entire state structure and the entire government structure. Now, I think I'll use what Mr. Gagyani has said to segue to Rory. Because Rory, you of course have great insight into Pakistan, but you have great insight into a lot of other similar jurisdictions. So be it enforced disappearances in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, or extrajudicial killings in many of the countries in South Asia or beyond, in Philippines with Duterte's drug war. And when we talk about, particularly in Pakistan, when we talk about these issues, sometimes, but as Mr. Gagyani was saying, that there are problems which, he gave the example of the United States, but there are problems which are common in terms of the challenges that governments face. And in your experience, I think it'll be very beneficial for everyone here to listen to your experience of what has worked and what hasn't in dealing with enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detention, and the wider set of rule of law. So I think that, if you could talk about that, that would be very valuable.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, and thank you really to the Asma Jahangir Foundation and AGHS, for organising these wonderful 2 days. And as someone who knew and worked alongside Asma, was mentored by Asma over many years, it's been wonderful to experience her spirit among everyone these sessions. Yes, the problems that we're talking about, this terrible toxic mix of enforced disappearance, torture as well, has really been a scourge in the South Asia region. Usually these types of cases occur, I think, in 3 broad patterns or contexts. Firstly, we often see them in the context of democracy struggles against a military or authoritarian regime. That certainly has been the experience of Pakistan in the past. It's very much what's happening in Myanmar today. Amongst the thousands of people arrested since the coup in February, there are hundreds of people who have been taken into unacknowledged detention, and their whereabouts are unknown. I think the second type of cases are the ones we've been discussing here, which come up very much in this context of conflict, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, and this is very much the context we've seen here in Pakistan, particularly the cases you're talking about from 2015, 2016, but also in Indian administered Kashmir. I think this is again where we see this type of disappearance. And the third type of case, it's a new type really, which we see emerging in some countries where these disappearances are linked much more to land issues, environment issues, sometimes drug enforcement issues, and where again, activists, journalists, and others have touched on powerful political or economic nerves, and this has been the form of reprisal. by the state or by other powerful private actors. So I think we see a spread of these phenomena across the region, and in a way, many of them have been manifest here in Pakistan. When I look at the region, I mean, there have also been a number of efforts to investigate, bring redress, prevent enforced disappearances. And this is largely thanks really to the tireless campaign and efforts of the survivors and families of the disappeared, and I'd very much like to pay tribute to our panelists. But also to the, some good judgments from higher courts, including here in Pakistan, efforts of tireless campaigners like Baba Saab. So there has been movement on these issues, and yet still these measures nowhere have really been sufficient or have really achieved the result. In Sri Lanka, for instance, where you had tens of thousands of enforced disappearances in the course of the conflict and insurgency over 3 decades, there have been several successive presidential commissions of inquiry that produced actually a vast amount of documentation and information on cases. And then in 2017, they created a dedicated Office of Missing Persons that was intended to follow up on all of this, and both in terms of investigation, but also reparation to the victims. And while it got off to a good start, with the change of government in Sri Lanka, it's also taken a backward step and is really, focusing only on the reparation aspect, and is really struggling to keep the confidence of the victims and their families. And the same happened in Nepal. Actually today is the 15th anniversary of the peace agreement in Nepal, which included a number of these mechanisms, including an Office of Missing Persons. And it's also really struggled with, independence and resources and the trust of the victims. So when we look at the Commission of Inquiry established here in Pakistan, 2011, I mean, it's a similar experience. It should serve an important purpose, but it has proved not to be fit for purpose. While it has managed to trace and track down, many hundreds or thousands of cases on paper, it hasn't led to any real accountability or any real reparation to victims. But I still think it's worth thinking about what role a dedicated commission or institution or mechanism can play in having a holistic approach to this issue, rather than just approaching only the issue on the level of individual cases, but looking at it in a collective way. Now, several countries have also gone through the process of criminalizing enforced disappearances. And this is really important, obviously, to prevent the recurrence of this violation. And we've been working with Thailand, with the Republic of Korea. Malaysia is now interested in a law of this kind. And of course, we've been following closely the passage of the enforced disappearances law that's been proposed in the parliament in Pakistan, and that many of you have been advocating for. But we are concerned that the latest draft, includes these clawback provisions, in particular one that really would put the onus on victims by making it punishable to bring false complaints of disappearance, which really turns the whole thing on its head. And when you have victims who already need great courage, actually, to bring cases forward, this will really even further raise the barriers to justice. So we really hope this draft can be improved and really brought in line with the international standard. But as Baba Saab, I think, said, I mean, a law to criminalize disappearances it's important, but it's not sufficient. Because the law has to be accompanied, firstly, I think, by looking at all the other laws that create the enabling environment for this to happen. I think of the Prevention of Terrorism Act in Sri Lanka, but here it might be this aid to the civil power regulation, that gives sweeping powers of detention to the security forces, intelligence services, and so you need to strip back these other laws, but also I think, as Baba Saab said, you need to tackle the question of security sector reform. What is the apparatus that has perpetrated this, and how to build in the civilian oversight and the checks and balances and the controls that are needed to prevent that happening again. Lastly, just one way to bring all of this together, of course, is to ratify the International Convention on Enforced Disappearances. And here in Pakistan, the Supreme Court has already held that the principles of the convention apply in Pakistan, under the right to life in the Constitution. But ratifying the convention would really cement that, in a long-term basis and legacy. We have about 5 countries in the region so far that have ratified the convention, including Sri Lanka, including Cambodia. Malaysia is considering at the moment. But it would be a very powerful signal, I think, if Pakistan could join that committed group of countries on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Rory. This was very valuable. Now, moving on in the issue of enforced disappearances in particular, and what has come up in the discussion so far, and anyone who's worked on this issue or engaged with the broader area in Pakistan or elsewhere, knows that probably out of all human rights violations, enforced disappearances, or missing persons, as we call them in Pakistan, is perhaps the most heartbreaking one. It perhaps extracts a cost which has no parallel because of the lack of closure, because of the feeling of helplessness. And Amna Janjua Sahiba, now for many years, both symbolizes and personifies not only how the cost of losing a loved one to this crime of enforced disappearances, but also of the resolve that Rory was also talking about, alluded to, of victims, of families, of loved ones, to fight not only for their cause, but for the larger struggle. And I'd like to talk to Amna Sahiba.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you so much. Thank you, AJ Conference, Asma Jahangir Foundation, AGHS, for organizing this beautiful 2 days conference, which has every aspect of human dignity involved in it. And I would like to congratulate the organizers of this conference. As this panel is all about enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killing, and so I would like to shed some light on my personal experience that I'm a victim of enforced disappearance. My husband, Masood Janjua, was a businessman, and he was an educator. And he was traveling along with his friend on 30th July 2005 from Rawalpindi to Peshawar. On the way, they both disappeared, and to date, we have no information as to what happened to them. I have 3 children, 2 boys and 1 girl. They were very small at that time, and they have grown up all these years without the love and affection of their father. So that was the first thing which comes to anybody's mind whose loved one is taken away, and without giving any justification for it, without giving the reason why, what crime he has done. For all those whose loved one is taken away, they will never give up. We can die, but we cannot give up. So this is the problem with all the cases, all the victims of enforced disappearances whose loved ones have been taken away, that they will continue for their whole life to get the news, get the truth, even if they have died. We have a right to know. Our children have a right to know if their father is no more. Where's the grave? Where should we go for offering Fatiha? Where's the symbol? Because it's easy to cope up with anybody whose loved one is died. But for those whose loved ones are disappeared, it's a lifelong agony. You can't even live, and you have to live. You can't even breathe, and you have to breathe. You have to continue in spite of every agony you face. And being a woman especially is more a torture, because in Pakistani society, women are supposed to be sheltered by their spouses, by their husbands. And same was the case with me. I was a housewife. I was a timid girl at that time, and I was sheltered by my husband. But then, when my husband was taken away, I had to become an activist. I had to come up. I had to become a fighter. And I had to tell the world that it is not acceptable. And for all those who cannot think of all those who have suffered like I have suffered. So there was no one in 2005, there was no one to raise a voice for it. And then when I realized that there are so many other families who are running pillar to post and there's no one to help them even the parliamentarians were not ready to listen to them. What to say about the Supreme Judiciary and the lawyers? Of course, lawyers had to take fees, and they had no fees to offer. So I realized that I have to make a network of all the aggrieved families, and that was how it started. And we started sitting in front of the Parliament House and in front of the Supreme Court to make both the two Parliament and as well as the Supreme Court accountable. That what are you doing for the disappearances, which are occurring so rampantly? And it's ongoing since then. It's ongoing. It has not stopped. In the beginning, it was the war on terror, but now it has touched the lawyers who are raising voice for, or who are fighting the cases of the disappeared. Then there are the journalists who are covering the cases of the disappearances. Then also who are the dissenting voices, progressive voices, like the bloggers which were picked up. So this social media activists, anybody who does not agree with the state narrative can be picked up. So that fight has broadened, not just the war on terror, the nationalists of Balochistan, Sindhi activists, Sindhi political activists, all of them are getting disappeared, and it has grown since then and not stopped because the parliamentarians, the politicians thought it was the army's business. It's not an issue we should step into it, or else we will get into trouble. So that was why they stepped. They only raised voice, but then they did nothing. So finally, we have a political party, PTI, who raised this as a legislation. So this legislation was initially very good, not sufficient, but it adopted the same definition which was adopted by the United Nations Convention for the Protection of All Persons Against Involuntary Disappearance. So that was the good part, that the definition is the same, but it does not involve all the parts which need redress. Like there is no truth which will be given to those who have died. This is absolutely absent in this legislation. There is no area for compensation, reparation, guarantees for non-occurrence, because we have seen that there are cases when enforced disappearance happens and the person is released, and again he's disappeared. Again and again this thing continues. So it's the biggest torture on earth. And this another thing which was, when this law went to the Interior Committee, there were two new clauses which were added in this law. One was that any of the enforced disappeared perpetrator will not be punished. Then second thing was that all those victims who are claiming falsely about the disappearance of their loved one and they cannot prove it will have a 5-year sentence and then a 1 lakh rupees fine. So I think this clause means that this law is not going to protect the victims, but rather it's going to protect the perpetrators. This law is completely, like crashes the whole victim's struggle. I'm not saying my struggle, but I'm saying all the victims from Balochistan, from Sindh, from KP, or all the struggles of the victims will be crashed after this. Because as soon as this law is going to pass, because I'm a very good friend of Shiri Mazari, and also I'm discussing this fact. And she's saying that if we are going to stress upon this clause, then maybe you are not going to get anything at all. So, but my reservation is that if we are not going to eliminate this clause from this law, then we'll be in a fix, and immediately after this law will be passed, then we will be punished for being the victim and for being the activists and defenders of this cause. So that is my concern, but what the question was, Sarup Saab, that have we achieved something? So my good practice is, like success story is that out of the 2,818 cases which have come to me in my organization, Defense of Human Rights, 900 of them have been released and traced, and still there's so it only happened because of networking, because we were together, and we were active with the civil society, with the parliamentarians. We were all the time meeting Babar Saab when he was in the Senate as well, and even after that. And not just lobbying with the parliamentarians, with the top brass as well. I have touched their doors, I have knocked at their door, because they are the ones who have a hand in this. So how can we eliminate in our campaign? We can ask everybody and not the top brass, because they are actually the ones. And I think when I met the DG ISPR way back in 2019, maybe a lot was wrong, but one thing was positive in that he admitted that yes, there are disappearances, and our heart goes out for that. So this is one, I would say, their commitment or their admission that Army has a hand in the disappearance of people. So it didn't work out because they have continued to say that many are disappeared on their own, and there's no way forward for them. But I will keep on knocking at their door as well as international community, which is very, very important in this cause. When I was given threats and my children were beaten, I was myself beaten in 2014. So what I realized was that when I was going to the UN's office, I was stopped, and I was harassed and given that threat that if you try to go to the UN, we will not allow it. So now the cause is finished. I was told that the cause is finished because there are laws like Action in Aid to Civil Power Regulations and Pakistan Protection Act, which says that disappearances are allowed, they are legal. So when the disappearances are legal, then what am I doing in the streets of Pakistan? So I was given a very, very strong word bashing that your cause is finished. But I said that I am still aggrieved. My husband has not been given to me. That I will stay on the streets no matter what. And I will go to the international community. That was why I went to the Amnesty International, to the speaking tour of the Europe. I went to all the parliaments in Europe. And then I got affiliated with AFAD. And I thank them a lot because they were the ones who sustained us. Because, you also have to have some resources to continue. So it's a very long pitch battle. You have to stay on the crease. Whether you are moving ahead with the speed of the snail or with the speed of a tortoise or with the speed of the rabbit. But you have to stay on the crease. So that's what we did. And I'm thankful to all the civil society people, all the lawyers who supported us. and especially the international community, the UN Working Group of the Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances, the UN Pakistan representatives who really helped us and guided us as to what to do. So later on in 2018, when the Supreme Court doors were closed for the victims, and after the Saqib Nisar gave the final order of transferring 700 cases of the disappeared to the Commission of Inquiry, which is a hellhole, I would say, clearly. There's no going ahead after you go to the commission. There are 200 plus cases whose production orders have been given, but there's no way forward for them because they were not produced and there's no hearing of their cases since then. So I would say that we have to move on no matter what. I'm thankful to the international community who, with their pressure and with their statements, when human rights defenders were attacked, they issued statements. They issued statements when our own members were kidnapped and they were disappeared. So there was reprisal for doing what I am doing. But now when I have started submitting cases, like 300 of our cases have been submitted to the working group. I'm not saying that they are with the pressure of the working group, they are all released, but I'm saying that with the pressure of this international involvement, our lives are a bit secure. And the threats and the harassment which was going on, they have stepped back. So this is the success we have to continue. And I would like to give message to the youth and the young lawyers that they have to come forward. It should be a mix of legal and campaign. Only legal will not work, and only campaign will not work. So it has always been in our success stories. There are both the cases when in Myra Sajid case, we campaigned, and also we had a case in the Islamabad High Court. We got the very good orders in which the compensation was awarded. That was the first time in the history of Pakistan that the case of disappeared was given. Almost as much as the salary of the disappeared was allowed for the family of Myra Sajid to be given to her from the day her husband was kidnapped. So these are the very good precedents which have been achieved by continuous struggle, legal as well as campaign. And that's it, I think. Thank you so much.
To find optimism, and rightly so, through the resilience that you've displayed. We're very grateful to have had this opportunity. Now, moving on to Michael, I think, Michael, what has come up in all the conversations so far of a state or a government saying, as I said in the beginning, the subtext is that there are exceptional times which call for exceptional measures. And how to balance, and I mean, you would have experience from, of course, on jurisdictions and countries that you worked in on, is how to balance effective sort of policing or with the counterinsurgency or counterterrorism with a respect for fundamental freedoms and the theme of this conference, human dignity. And I think that's perhaps, an international perspective on that, and of course your insight into the Pakistan situation. I'd very welcome that.
As I've told people who I've been with for the past 2 days, I've learned more about Pakistan and the legal system in this past 2 days than the entire 4 months I've been in country. So I definitely appreciate this get together because it's been an eye-opening experience for me. For those who don't know me, I am a federal prosecutor in the United States. I am the resident legal advisor for the U.S. Embassy here in country, and I have been a corruption prosecutor for the past 20 years. So my entire experience has been going after the watchers. So the people who watch us need to be watched, and that was my job, is to watch the watchers. And one of the goals here in country for the U.S. Embassy, and for me specifically, is to set up the capacity, both judicially and prosecution, about how to enforce the laws and make sure people don't violate our civil liberties, our right to life, and our human dignity. So I definitely appreciate the opportunity here to address all of you. One thing I've learned from the panel And I think we echo this, is the rule of law is probably the most paramount thing we have in any civil society, the rule of law. And I equate that to, if you guys are familiar with the Brooklyn Bridge in New York, it's an enormous bridge, but the foundation of that bridge lies underneath 200 feet of water, and that's the foundation of that bridge. And without that foundation, you wouldn't have the Brooklyn Bridge connecting two boroughs. And so that foundation is the most quintessential importance of that bridge, and that's the rule of law. We don't see it. We can talk about it, but we don't see it. Only when it rears its ugly head, when things don't work the way it's supposed to, that we get concerned about it. And one thing that doesn't work here in Pakistan is there's not enough capacity for the courts and for the prosecution. And I see this every day, that the presumption is for arrest, the presumption is for incarceration, the presumption is not to have initial appearances, the presumption is to incarcerate somebody and then their case lingers for years and years and years. And that is a horrible way to run a judicial and legal system. I'm not here to point fingers at any one body or one group of people, but one of the things I'm tasked with here is to work with the courts and the provincial government is how do we institute the U.S. best practices. And one of the best practices in the U.S. is, are you guys familiar with the concept called initial appearances? And so when someone gets arrested, when someone disappears, the habeas petition is filed and they have to bring the body to court. They have to show why this person is arrested, why this person is detained. Without that, then the court steps in and sanctions and releases and has a menu of options for rectifying that situation. But if the courts don't have that ability here, or if they lack the ability to exercise that ability, that it breaks down that foundation and the bridge starts to crumble. And then I met with plenty of prosecution offices who we point fingers at the government and we point fingers at people who don't enforce this law, but when you talk to these prosecutors who are ill-trained, no experience, they don't have the capacity, sometimes they don't have the infrastructure or an office, they don't have internet connection, they don't have the salaries or the capacity to even do some of these cases, and we expect them to handle burglaries and homicides, and on the same side we expect them to handle missing person cases, we expect them to handle extraditions, we expect them to handle terrorism cases, and that's just a heavy load for a prosecution office to handle. And so one of the things that I see here is one of the things I've been tasked with is what kind of solutions could be offered here for Pakistan to help ameliorate some of these issues. One is in the United States, the Department of Justice has a public integrity unit, and that public integrity unit is tasked with one job only, and that job is to go after the judges and the prosecutors who don't do their job or commit crime, to go after state officials, go after military officials, go after anyone who violates the law, and that public integrity unit is set aside, is apart from the other agencies, and it's funded and it's endorsed and supported by every single political group, every single political party, and it's definitely not politically biased. At least it's not supposed to be. And I know the U.S. sometimes has a checkered history when we talk about, but most of our disappearances and most of our arbitrary detention is outside the terrorism framework. Most of this is internal. Most of this is because people dissent against the government. And that carries the majority of the cases here in Pakistan. And but one of the things that it's important for us to keep in mind is if we don't give capacity buildings to the courts and to the prosecution, I don't think it's a failure of democracy. I don't. I think it's a failure of will and a failure of the courts and the prosecution to enforce the law that's on the books. And I've been familiar with the laws. I've been helping train. I've been case mentoring, and there's some pretty hard-hitting laws on the books already. It just lacks the capacity and the will and the want to do those. So I know there's a distinguished panel here, and we can field some questions if there's some more questions. I know we're running out of time, so I'm trying to keep mine short and brief. And
thank you. I mean, I agree, and I think that the idea that there are lacunas, which Rory has talked about, which Baba Sahib has talked about, which is amendments, perhaps, in the law to bring them in line with international best practices, criminalizing enforced disappearances, etc. But yes, I agree that the answer perhaps does not lie in more laws. But so now I think we'll have about 10 minutes of more discussion and then perhaps open it to questions if there are any. But I think one thing that has come up, and throughout this discussion on arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances, and extrajudicial killing, is a consensus, and segue from what Michael was saying, that the criminal justice system in Pakistan is broken and dysfunctional. And when we talked about enforced disappearances, or we talked about extrajudicial killings, to my mind, the idea that we can treat this in isolation with the rest of the criminal justice system, which problems that you mentioned, the problems of delay, of the courts being sort of overburdened, is you can't probably create an island out of solving the problem of enforced disappearance up to the point that you have a criminal justice system that is efficient, transparent, equitable, at least at some level. And Babar Sahab, in terms of criminal justice system reform, the larger conversation of a criminal justice system, which all three levels, the level of investigation, the police, the level of prosecution, the government, and level of adjudication, the courts. What can be sort of, in your long experience as a parliamentarian, and I know it's sort of very difficult to ask for recommendations there, but we're running out of time. So what would be key items? Because up to the point that we raise the floor of the criminal justice system, we'll not be able to surgically solve the problem of enforced disappearances if courts are being dysfunctional. So what, in your opinion, could be some top-line recommendations of making this entire criminal justice system more functionable, more equitable, more
Well,
efficient?
as a matter of fact, we need massive judicial reforms. The criminal justice system of Pakistan is broken, and just to give you an example, 2 brothers were sentenced to death. They spent years on the death row, and finally, when the Supreme Court acquitted them and the order went to the jail, it transpired that they had already been hanged. So in a country where the justice system is so broken, therefore we need to have massive judicial reforms, number one. Now what those 2 important judicial reforms can be, of course the judiciary at the lower level requires a number of reforms, but the judiciary at the top level also needs reforms. And 2 areas in which there is a need for judicial reforms are, number 1, the appointment of judges, and number 2, the suo motu powers of the judges. Remember, the judges are unique position that they adjudicate between the state institutions. They determine the constitutional parameters of the powers of each state institution. And when the judiciary interprets the constitution and the law in a manner that increases only the powers of the Supreme Court and not the powers of other democratic institutions, I think that is a fundamental flaw in the judicial system. And it is an awesome power. It is an awesome power when you sit on the podium to decide about various state institutions and the extent of their empowerment. And when you sit in judgment and seem to be empowering yourself and disempowering other state institutions, I think it's an awesome power. And when the power is awesome, it requires checks and balances. So that is one thing that we need to have. And secondly, also, I think that the appointment of judges. We have seen that through judicial verdicts, the Prime Minister has no role, the President has no role, the Parliament has no role. Now, the nominations are made by the Honorable Chief Justice, and the recommendation final is made by a committee which is dominated by the Honorable Judges. So unfortunately, it invites the criticism that it becomes a judiciary of the judges, for the judges, by the judges, and therefore this impression must be dispelled. And finally, I would like to say that no matter what laws you make, the parliament is criticized. The parliament should not be over-criticized because the parliament has made laws, but the trouble is when the law is not implemented. If the parliament has made the law to bring the ISI under legislation, and if the executive does not concur with that, does not come back to the parliament, I think the parliament should not be held responsible. The parliament made a law in 2013 that proscribed, banned militant organizations will not be allowed to resurrect under different names. But what happened? Jaish-e-Mohammed was banned, but the state went to China, requested China to stop the move in the United Nations to take action against Maulana Masood Azhar. So when the parliament makes the law and the executive flouts that law, there is nothing that you can do unless we have massive judicial reform. Thank you very much.
I think perhaps because in the interest of time, perhaps the last question to Rory. Rory, the same question that I was largely asking Baba Saab, that we've talked about sort of enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detentions, which are very acute manifestations of a broken criminal justice system, and to talk about, I mean, he's talked about judicial reform, but one area that we haven't had the opportunity to talk about so far is the prison reform, because the idea that, you know, there is, as I said, enforced disappearances, internment centers, those exist beyond the bound of the law. But what exists between, and for both Pakistan and for other countries that you work on or supervise work on in the region, in terms of prison reforms, a conversation or any insight into what needs to be done and what has worked so far? Because in Pakistan, it's not only the internment centers. That, of course, as I said, is the acute manifestation of what's wrong. But what's wrong is the rot is deep, and the rot is in Camp Jail Lahore or Central Jail Karachi. And again, my question would be the last question I asked: what has worked and what hasn't, and in other jurisdictions, and for the specific circumstances of Pakistan, if you can draw some lessons or recommendations, perhaps, and then we'll open it to questions.
Have been mentioned by other panelists. I mean, I think on one level, this extreme of enforced disappearance and extrajudicial killing has its own specificity. And of course, in the context of the counterterrorism and other measures, it has its own dynamics. But in some ways, it is also a function of this broken criminal justice system, because when the system is broken, the incentive is there for the law enforcement, security forces to take summary extrajudicial action. And we certainly see this in the context of drug enforcement in a country like the Philippines, for instance, where there have been thousands of alleged extrajudicial killings of minor drug suspects who have been gunned down. I mean, effectively in a kind of cleanup operation. Now, Baba Saab has talked about reforms at the judicial level. I think when it comes to the broader law enforcement prison issues, the first is what are we putting people in prison for, and how do we, approach this in terms of alternatives to detention? For a lot of offences, the reason that jails are so overcrowded is because there are many people in jail, firstly, who are in pre-trial detention, haven't yet even been brought before the court or reached the trial stage. As many as 60, 70% quite often in pre-trial detention. So through the use of bail, through the use of early release and clemency and other powers, how do you bring down that caseload and pressure that is, really, breaking the system? And I think this is the first point: alternatives to detention, reducing this over-reliance on pre-trial detention, and secondly, perhaps looking at the nature of offences and sentences. And there are many people serving sentences or under trial for offences that for which imprisonment is actually not the appropriate sanction or rehabilitation. Minor drug offences, possession of drugs for personal use, and so forth. Again, a category of people who could be handled with alternatives to detention. So I think reducing pretrial detention, exploring alternatives to detention, these are very important reforms that would reduce that overall burden on the system. A lot of this has come up in the context of COVID, because of COVID, very dangerous in the prison system. And so last year we saw a number of countries, including Pakistan, begin to release some categories of prisoners to decongest the jails to prevent the spread of COVID. So this was very welcome. But how can we somehow institutionalize that moment, or capture that moment for a longer term institutional policy reform that not just about COVID, but can really put the system onto a better footing?
Thank you, Rory. And with this, I think our discussion has come to an end. It was a very, very interesting discussion, and it was a long one, but the subject was such that there's a very lot of ground to cover. And now we'd have just very little time for questions. If there is one or two questions, perhaps. Okay, sure. We'll start from here. Yes, please. Ji.
Is that we've talked about what has happened, what is happening. My question is that as a young lawyer, where do we stand? Where should we look out for? Because as the youth, one thing we can say that there is nothing but hopelessness. There is nothing but confusion, because we don't know what to do about it and how to feel about this as especially lawyer, because we know that raising voice in this country, especially for women, can end up to severe consequences, as Ms. Amna also mentioned. So where do we stand, and what should we do as an individual person to live and fight within this system against this issue? And what should we do? Is there any ray of hope for us, or is there anything that we can do? Because honestly, we are really hopeless. There is so confusion. There is we're very hopeless, and I don't know what to do about this. So if you as adults could tell us regarding this.
I'll take a couple of questions. I mean, very important one. Ji, aap bhi bata.
My question is from Faratullah Baba. Currently, we are facing the hybrid and popularity, not in Pakistan, but across the South Asia, even India as well. My question is that, do you believe that it can see a dream in Pakistan, maybe a next hybrid regime abroad, as we are observing currently, because there is a controlled democracy, controlled media and all that. So can we introduce a brief mechanism for criminalizing this offense, and what the struggle of Amina Jujua can be practically implemented in this country? Because the rare problem, as a number of panelists has mentioned, that there is a problem actually in executing the laws in Pakistan, not just enforcing laws. So the next hybrid regime in Pakistan, what we believe, can have a capacity to produce, because institutional will is not matter. The supremacy of the will of the people, that is matter a lot in the objective resolution. That's my question.
गर्ल्स की एक तो ये है ना कि पाकिस्तान में पावर भी है. आई एम टेलिंग यू कि अगर मैं लड़का मर्द होती तो शायद मैं वहाँ तक ना पहुँचती. जो बीइंग अ वुमन हैज़ ऑल्सो गिवन मी अ लॉट ऑफ पावर. सो इफ़ यू आर अ लेडी, so be confident and don't be confused, because this is something to do with about freedom of those who are underprivileged or oppressed, somewhere in the underground torture cells, somewhere in the jails of Pakistan. So it's our duty to work from them, to bring them outside. If you are not going to work for them, we are going to stay silent, then this lack of freedom is going to touch every household in Pakistan. First there was war and terror, then there's nationalist issue, then to just go on counting, the journalist Matiullah Jan was abducted, and the lawyer Colonel Inam was abducted because we kept silent, and there was no, I would say, unity in all the victims. So victims should be united, and the lawyers have a big, very big community. The lawyers pushed the dictator Musharraf outside. So be confident. Lawyers can do everything possible in the world. So therefore, I have also become a lawyer now. So be confident.
इजाज़त से सर एक बात मैं सिर्फ ऐड करूं कि अगर आप लेडी लायर हो तो दिस आयरन लेडीज बिफोर यू, ये आपके सामने एक मिसाल है, आपको सवाल ही पूछना नहीं चाहिए था। इंडिविजुअल कैपेसिटी में मैं बताता हूँ, आई एम डीलिंग क्रिमिनल केसेस, मोर देन 1000 केसेस आई एम डीलिंग फ्री ऑफ कास्ट ऑफ द ऑप्रेस्ड पीपल regarding the missing person commission, more than 100 cases of the military court convicted I am dealing. So everyone, especially lawyers, अगर हमारी community आएंगी क्योंकि they are custodian of law, we are knowing the rights, the constitution, the fundamental rights of individual, तो हम ये आगे आने individual capacity में without affiliation with any party, political party or NGO, etc. Thank you so much.
Just one thing, that I think there are many questions, and sadly we're running out of time, but we actually run out of time, and this hall would be needed for another session. So, does a panelist want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to
Sure.
real quick, I just want to echo the young lady who asked the question. I like the idea that lawyers run everything, which is great. But you're doing exactly what you're supposed to do as a young professional, is you voice your opinion, you're open to the new ideas, and when you're sitting at the dinner table or you're sitting with your colleagues, you're sitting having a breakfast or a meal, you express your ideas, and the more ideas get expressed, the more they gain traction. And it's a war of ideas, and when you get older and when you get more power, you start making more changes and stuff. So you're doing exactly what you're supposed to do.
I'm afraid we can't detain this room because there's another session, and I believe that the guests for the other session are here. तो ये बातचीत जारी रह सकती है, लेकिन हमें ये कमरा जो है मेरा ख्याल है या ये स्टेज खाली करना पड़ेगा. I'm very thankful to बाबर साहब तो आपके हर सवाल का जवाब दे के जाएंगे, वो स्टेज पे दें या ना दें. बाबर साहब तो very grateful for the panelists, and very grateful to you, the audience, and thank you.